Okay, so welcome everybody. Welcome to the Millennium Conference, the 2020 Millennium Conference, Entanglements and Detachments in Global Politics. And specifically welcome to this panel entitled Becoming Human with Others, Animality and Decolonial Entanglements. My name is Milja Kurki, and I will be chairing the session today. I'll be doing so from Mid Wales in Aberystwyth, but I welcome you, of course, from all parts of the world. We have guests, visitors, participants, as well as listeners and audience members from all parts of the world. So welcome everybody. It's lovely to have you all here. I hope many of you will have had good discussions already this morning as the conference has started. And I hope you will find this panel an exciting and thought-provoking one to contribute to the existing discussions. As you know, the conference interrogates existing approaches as well as new approaches to thinking about global connectivity and also disconnectivity, entanglements and detachments. And as the organizations put it, the heterogeneity of and shared nature of vulnerabilities, including entanglements of societies, species and environments. And we have been given various questions to think about around ethics of entanglement and detachment, and questions around how we think about seemingly separate worlds and histories being entangled with each other. And this panel here, it addresses the question of human-animal entanglements, and does so in the context of particularly kind of decolonial and colonial entanglements. So specifically, the organizers intended this roundtable to interrogate the race-bound meanings of human and animal, and to connect conversations around multi-species justice to questions about dehumanization in a colonial context. So I'm really excited to introduce you and welcome you to the panel. And I'm also really excited to introduce you to the speakers on this panel, who are just the most interesting and fantastic people to speak on this subject. So we will proceed in the order in the program. So the first speaker will be Nyamnjoh of the University of Cape Town, and the author, among many other things, of the prize-winning monograph, hashtag Roads Must Fall, Nibbling at Resilient Colonialism in South Africa. Second speaker will be Zakiyyah Iman Jackson of the University of Southern California, and the author, among many other things, of the book Becoming Human, Matter and Meaning in an Anti-Black World. Third, we will hear from Chen of the University of California, Berkeley, and the author, again, among many other things, of the book Animacies, Biopolitics, Racial Mattering and Queer Effect. And finally, we will hear from Erika Cudworth of the Montfort University, and the author of books such as The Social Lives with Other Animals, and also with Steve Houghton, of course, Post-Human International Relations and Emancipatory Project of Post-Humanism. I'm sure you agree that we have a really exciting set of speakers for this roundtable today. And so I really encourage you to enjoy it, take notes, think of questions, think of conversation topics for how we proceed. Before we proceed into the actual presentations and then the Q&A that will follow, let me just run through some practical matters that the organizers would like me to share with you. First of all, do bear in mind that we need to be respectful of different views and opinions in this forum, and bear in mind that it's a forum for constructive exchange of ideas and discussion. Secondly, please do note that the session is being recorded and also that photographs may be taken during the session. And third, when we get to the Q&A at the end of the panel, please do send your questions through the Q&A function on the panel. You should find it at the bottom of your screen. If you ask your questions there, I will then pick them and ask them to the panelists as we proceed. Obviously, do bear in mind that if you ask any questions in the Q&A function, that also do avoid any offensive, inappropriate, discriminatory content on there. And should any such appear, do be reminded that you may be removed from the event altogether. So with those notes out of the way, without further ado, let us open up for the discussion. So 10, 12 minutes for each of the speakers, and I'll try to be discreet, waving perhaps when you have about a minute or thereabouts to go, and hopefully that will work just fine. And without further ado, let's proceed with the first speaker. Francis Nyamnjoh, please, would you take the floor?
Thanks, Milja. It's a great pleasure to be part of this conversation. And I've been thinking ever since I received the invitation, how to talk about issues that have meant a lot to me in my lived experiences as well as in my research. And I thought, and this morning it occurred to me that perhaps a more effective way of going about it would be to share with you some childhood memories from the Cameroon grass fields. That's where I was born. That's where I grew up. I went to secondary school in the grass fields before I started my university journey. And if there's anything called enculturation or socialization, I should have picked up enough about the human animal dynamics to be able to share in this panel. And I thought I would go back to my childhood to excavate some of those memories and put on the table for us to have a common meal of it. The first memory is that it is in the grass fields, it is considered immoral and indeed harmful to eat alone. And basically, not only are we expected to eat in order to survive, to sustain ourselves, to be able to fulfill our ambitions, we are expected as well to make it possible for others to eat in order for us to keep eating. So eating is a very central preoccupation. And by others eating, I mean both fellow humans and other creatures. And those other creatures necessarily, we think of those in the environment from which we draw for sustenance and so on and so forth. So from very early on, you are schooled to understand the importance of this interconnection between humans and the wider environment in terms of just how much you need to take in order best to take yourself out. In order best to fulfill yourself, you need sustenance. But that is something that you are expected to do in a very civil and a very understanding way, because the only way you can keep eating and keep growing is to ensure that eating is reciprocal, that what you eat at the same time, you are able to enable yourself to be eaten. And both in real terms and metaphorically. How do you enable yourself to be eaten? You have to spend time, for example, in the wider environment, whether vegetation or animals, grooming them, growing them, offering them an environment to reproduce themselves so you can continue to benefit from them. And the same applies to humans. Once a child is born in the grass fields, there's a common proverb that says, one person's child is only in the womb. Basically, almost figuratively, you're fed upon by the wider society as they see fit, each from their own vantage point and from their felt need. So this eating metaphor captures very well the sociality as well as the ethics of reproduction that we need to be able to sustain ourselves. So if we come into the eating game in a very selfish way and self-absorbed, only thinking of yourself and what you need, then you soon run out of food, or you run out of the relationships that nourish you. This emphasizes interconnections in myriad ways. And that is around those sort of interconnections that people are able to activate themselves in fascinating ways. It also points to an early recognition of the fact that being incomplete is a normal way of being. Humans have the tendency to pontificate and to sit in judgment and define both themselves as well as defining the environment and so on. But in the grass fields, we are told to beware of rushing into such self-importance, and that if we cultivate the humility of incompleteness, then we can inform and nourish these interconnections. And one way of seeing incompleteness in play is that we learn to appreciate ourselves not as autonomous, being unified subjects and singular, but as composite beings. And the composite beings factors in the idea that the environment from which you draw is part and parcel of you. And you also feed into that environment. And so this cyclical idea of compositeness of being means that although our appearance might suggest that we are singular and unified as humans, actually, they know better, these cultural communities that emphasize interconnections, about the fluidity of our being. We flow out into the various forms of life that nourish us and that we nourish. And just one quick example here is we draw on the forest and we draw from the bushes for sustenance. But so too do we carry ourselves back into these places to nourish them, sometimes both literally and in other ways. For example, if somebody passes on, they are buried in a nearby forest or a nearby bush. When you go to visit those you have buried, you see good vegetation growing on them, and animals come and eat off the luxurious vegetation that is there, which is points to the life cycle in which we are a part but an incomplete part. So incompleteness is key. Interconnections, interdependencies, indebtedness, debt and indebtedness are very important. The person who has the propensity to think of themselves in complete autonomous terms is one who is just who rushes to forget their debt and indebtedness. And this is something that comes through from the grass fields, but is shared across many African communities. I saw earlier on there was a storytelling session, and those of you who have read the writings of people like Amos Tutuola or Ben Okri and so on, you would see the depictions of a universe of such entanglements, and I would even go to say manglements of various kinds. Now, what is also common, and we are taught growing up in the grass fields, is the idea of endless mobilities. Mobilities flowing in and flowing out in all sorts of ways. Humans are able to feed into nature, nature into the human and the supernatural, and so on and so forth. So that you can only understand that in terms of mobilities and the lack of permanence of any condition. And those entanglements speak of conviviality and a world informed by the incompleteness, making us composite beings necessarily also speaks of a convivial disposition. So conviviality is not something that occurs between discrete complete entities, but it is a necessary underpinning of it is the reality of incompleteness, not as a negative, but as a disposition on which we can draw meaningfully to inform the way we live our lives. And I think since we mentioned decoloniality and so on and so forth, the factoring in incompleteness and conviviality therefore speaks more of decolonization as recognizing and providing for incompleteness as a way of a general organizing frame of who we are, eating and providing for the fact of being eaten, and therefore developing an ethics of eating in which you do not have a monopoly of indulging or consuming without being consumed in turn. So I think these are the childhood memories that I thought I would put on the table. They have informed my thinking and my writing on myriad subjects, and every time I think I've forgotten them through the education I get, which wants to make an individual of me, I'm being pulled back to say, do not be too much in a hurry to affirm yourself to the detriment of the interconnections and the compositeness that makes who you are. And that continues to make you an open-ended container. And there's always room more to take the outside in as a way of fulfilling your dreams. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Fantastic comments, and right on time as well, I should say. Thank you so much, Francis. Next, Zakiyyah, Imam Jackson, please. The floor is yours. You are muted at the moment. Yeah.
Oh, can you hear me now? Okay,
Perfect.
great. Thanks so much for inviting me, and thank you to my fellow panelists. While many scholars have critiqued the conflation of Black humans with animals found in Enlightenment discourses, many have also fundamentally misrecognized the logic behind the confluence of animality and racialization. Enlightenment thought should not simply be considered from the perspective of Black exclusion or denied humanity, but rather as the violent imposition and appropriation, inclusion and recognition of Black humanity in the interest of plasticizing that very humanity, whereby the animal is one but not the only form Blackness is thought to encompass. Plasticity is a mode of transmogrification, whereby the fleshly being of Blackness is experimented with as if it were infinitely malleable, lexical, and biological matter, such that Blackness is produced as sub, super, and human at once, a form where form shall not hold potentially everything and nothing at the register of ontology. It is perhaps prior scholarship's interpretation of this tradition as denied humanity that has facilitated a call for greater inclusion as a corrective to what it deems is a historical exclusion of Blackness. One consequence of this orientation is that many scholars have essentially ignored alternative conceptions of being and the non-human that have been produced by Blackened people. I pose 3 arguments to fundamentally reframe the animalization of Blackness. First, I argue that philosophers and historians' emphasis on anti-Black formulations of African reason and history have overlooked the centrality of gender, sexuality, and maternity in the analyzation of Blackness. Liberal humanism's basic unit of analysis, man, produces an untenable dichotomy, the human versus the animal, whereby the Blackened female is posited as the abyss, dividing organic life into human or animal based on wholly unsound metaphysical premises. I argue that Black female flesh persistently functions as a limit case of the human. This is largely explained by the fact that historically, the delineation between species has fundamentally hinged on the question of reproduction. In other words, the limit of the human has been determined by how the means and scene of birth are interpreted and the racialization of that function. Second, Eurocentric humanism needs Blackness as a prop in order to erect whiteness, to define its own limits, and to designate humanity as an achievement, as well as to give form to the category of the animal. Current scholarship in posthumanism, animal studies, new materialism, and theories of biopolitics has begun a broad inquiry into the repercussions of defining the human in opposition to the animal. Becoming Human, which is my book, clarifies the terms of the relationship between what Kerry Wolf calls the discourse of species and racial discourse by demonstrating that racialized gender and sexuality serve as an essential horizon of possibility for the production of the animal as a preoccupation of modern discourse. At times, anti-Blackness colors non-human animal objection. Anxieties about conquest, slavery, and colonial expansionism provided the historical context for both the emergence of a developmental model of universal humanity and a newly consolidated generic animal that would be defined in non-human and human terms. In this context, discourse on the animal and the Black, as well as those on race and species, were conjoined and are now mutually reinforcing narratives in the traveling racializations of the globalizing West. Both sciences and philosophy's foundational authority articulate Black female objection as a prerequisite of the human, and this objection helps give credence to the linear taxonomical or ontological thinking present scholarship is trying to displace. Thus, racialized formations of gender and sexuality are actually central rather than subsidiary to the very human-animal binarism recent scholarship hopes to dislodge. My third argument is for a decisive break with a commonly held position in the study of race. I do not propose the extension of human recognition as a solution to the bestialization of Blackness. Recognition of personhood and humanity does not annul the animalization of Blackness. Rather, it reconfigures discourses that have historically bestialized Blackness, forms of human recognition, inclusion in biological conceptions of the human species, and the transition from native to universal human subject in law and society are not at odds with animalization. Thus, animalization is not incompatible with humanization. What is commonly deemed dehumanization is, in the main, more accurately interpreted as the violence of humanization or the burden of inclusion into a racially hierarchized universal humanity. I look beyond recognition as a solution to bestialization, the bestialization of Blackness, by drawing out the dissident ontological and materialist thinking in Black expressive culture, lingering on modes of being, knowing, feeling that gesture toward the overturning of man. Within the structure of thought on race, there is an implicit assumption that the recognition of one as a human being will protect one from or acts as an insurance policy against ontologizing violence. Departing from a melancholic attachment to such an ideal, I argue that the violence and terror scholars describe is endemic to the recognition of humanity itself, when that humanity is cast as Black. A recognition of Black humanity is not denied or excluded in becoming human, I argue, but is weaponized by a conception of the human foundationally organized by the idea of a racial telos. For Sylvia Wynter, the Negro is not so much excluded from the category man and its overrepresentation of humanity, but foundational to it as its antipodal figure, as the nadir of man. I argue that the recognition of humanity and its suspension act as alibis for each other's terror, such that the pursuit of human recognition or a compact with human would only plunge one headlong into further terror and domination. Is the Black a human being? The answer is hegemonically yes. However, this in actuality may be the wrong question, as an affirmation offers no assurances. A better question may be, if being recognized as human offers no reprieve from ontologizing dominance and violence, then what might we gain from the rupture of the human? As long as the animal remains an intrinsic but abject feature of the human, Black freedom will remain elusive and Black lives in peril. As the animal and the Black are not only interdependent representations, but also entangled concepts. While there are particular Euro-anthropocentric discourses about specific animals, just as there are particular forms of anti-Black racialization based on ethnicity, gender, sexuality, and national origin, for instance, these particularizing discourses are in relation to the ongoing abstraction of the animal as the Black. To disaggregate humanity from the production of Black humanity, the one imposed on Blackened people assumes one could neutralize Blackness and maintain the human's coherence. But the neutralization of Blackness requires the dissolution of discourses on the animal and vice versa. But that is to say the least, unlikely, because the animal is a mode of being for which man is at war. What is more plausible is that attempts to neutralize Blackness and the animal will continue to be, in practice, if not word, a means of discipline and eradication. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Next, we have Milja Chen. The floor is yours. 10, 12 minutes or so.
Thank you, Mia. Can you hear me?
We can hear you well.
Great. Thank you so much to the co-organizers and all those behind the scenes who are putting this together. Thank you so much to Francis, especially for giving me thinking to do with the word manglements, and Zakiyyah for her critically important work, and Elena, all of whom I'm really honored to be sharing this virtual time and place with. So when we all dial in like this, the assumptions of shared place go away for better and worse. I am now in unceded Coast Salish, Stillaguamish, Duwamish, and Suquamish land known as Seattle, having driven north of where I normally am in Huichin Ohlone territory known as Oakland, Berkeley, California, to avoid the massive California fires and smoke and try to allay my asthma and chronic illness. I hope that this land acknowledgement also finds some company in the matter of my attention to ash later in this talk, so that, to quote the description of the panel, dehumanization in the colonial present takes form both in the dissolution and transformation of lives and non-lives in burning California into ash, but also in the form of the US Forest Service and its participation in ongoing land theft and the displacement of indigenous land management. So in a piece I've been writing with Tim Choi, this colonial present and the intensification of various emergencies such as COVID-19 coincide with new alignments, new excitations of troubled and violent paths. And I see the largely unthought mass turn to Zoom video conferencing as a substitute rather than as a complement, as one of those excitations that is a concerning alignment of, thinking again of what Francis said, it's sort of a wrong form of incomplete embodiment. So in my case, I just want to take part of my time to still say, please feel welcome to stay in your body. Feel free to turn away from the camera. It's just my face here. Listen only when you really can. Apply crypt logics to what we're doing here. Make this work for you and yours. And perhaps refuse to participate in the collapse and unification of mind bodies that Zooming asks of us. In this moment of its novelty and its broad application, it asks even more, I think, than being in person might have done. Something like feeling the obligation to answer a cell phone when your first brand new cell phone started ringing. So here's a jumble for you in 2 incomplete parts as my offer. First ash, then it. These parts are connected by way of agitation as a conditionally deliberate, but often indeliberate, often disabled form of gesture that must be counted as political. Ash, where is the animality of grief? The human grief alone that I can access is vast and immeasurable and unscalable. It's written into the bodies of those who loved those who have died of COVID-19 or loved those subjected to historical and legacy violence. And grief, as multi-species justice scholar Danielle Sellermeyer has shared, lives also in a pig who has witnessed and felt the losses of last year's Australian fires. There is loss that would be different loss were it attuned to the certainty of death, the scale of industrialism's consequence, the randomness of a body's vulnerability, even while we can correlate statistics of COVID's differential reach. That is the state of medicine and public health to the degree they touch someone at all, but it is also the reach of biopolitical management, which is in its intent and its necropolitical aim touches all in the end. In my book, I write about forms of unruliness, such as intoxicatory disorderings, in which one can trace both political agitation and forms of resistive response to the forms of capitalism's orders. So that bodily intolerance can be found in the social expression. There's only so much you can take, and the refusal of a forced embodiment of docility, non-insurgency, as much as in the coercions of environmentally inequitable ingestion, or what is understood as environmental injustice. In the last few years, fires in California have been making mockery of what used to be known as a delimited fire season. If climate disasters become characteristic of so many given places around the world right now, California's is fire and ash. This has been, of course, active for decades, but accelerated to the level of spectacle in the last few years. The air quality guidelines register a biopolitical image applying only to people interested in and having the capacity for individual self-protection, whether a shelter that has an indoors or masks. What is burning, what incinerates into the air is not only some fantasied exterior nature of trees, grasses, dirt, and other distant flora and their seemingly mundane chemical contents, but also built environments, including housing complexes, cars, barns, garages, and their own contents, such as paints, fuel, solvents, and other hazardous waste, insecticides, as well as living beings, insects, salamanders, bears, deer, frogs, and also people. So that not only are the lung-based absorptions of these particularly frictive asthmatic irritants, but also chemical in terms of intoxication. With regard to ash, there are aspects of it that are compelling to me. Its limited airborne lifetime and the way that it can amass and clump when it falls so that one can collect and toss it again after a death. I'm interested here in ash's quality as a thing that agitates. In my context, I attribute this to queer of color and other means of life, its misalignment with the interested production of human life as a racial mandate to biopolitical priority and species reproduction, while simultaneously attuning and tending to precisely those necropolitical forces that would normalize the queered life and death expectancies and queered community lives of Black, Indigenous people, as well as what are now most palpably the essential and disposable lives of a labor force that must keep a skeletal economy in operation during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm thinking here too of Eben Kirksey's recent multi-species work on chemosociality and endangered frogs and toxicity in Sydney, which describes a circumstance of presumably temporary thriving for an endangered frog species in a particularly toxic building site, which also happened to presage a housing future for a racialized class of minorities in Sydney. Toxic as a general nomination, but in fact nutrient-rich for forms of frog reproduction. California's ash also bears the marks of its own history of erasure. The periodic prescribed burns that were the regular practice of native tribes living in the area made such extravagant burning so much less likely before the typically misbegotten forest management system of scientific ecological state fire prevention. And so lest the ash of climate change get categorized into what is environmental, for which the new technoscience might recognize indigeneity only by drawing on indigenous fire management methods, I think there are potent reminders here of connections denied. And I think clearly a broader consideration of indigenous materialities. In my book, I focus my discussion of ash on a permanent art installation at the Magistrates Court in Brisbane, Australia by bachelor artist Fiona Foley. In 2004, it was called Witnessing to Silence. And it was my understanding of Foley's account as the story of a victorious deception. The call for the new court building included at least 3 elements. 1, environmentally sustainable design. And I'm citing that as a phrase. 2, the integration of art. And 3, support for victims of crimes. So Foley had initially presented the project proposal by way of a natural disaster, the increasingly frequent contemporary Australian bushfires, represented by a display of ashes in suspension, shards of black inside one of several vertical glass and metal cabinets mounted into the ground. But what she didn't reveal until later was that the quote-unquote bushfires marked genocide more than a century earlier. They in fact represented the ash, not of, say, ecological management's canonical objects of trees and scrub, but of Aboriginal bodies that had been quote unquote removed, to use the scientific language of colonial operations, by way of government instigated massacres all around Queensland as an accessory to white settlement. After the massacres, the bodies were burned. Arrayed on the ground in Foley's installation are stone panels, then each reading the name of one site of massacre. This is not just structural ambivalence, but a before and after pedagogy by which the relative mundanity and sympathy for burnt trees gives way necessarily and pointedly to charred bodies of genocide. The ash here is frozen in its agitation, the memory of its motion. There are lessons here of the inseparability of settler colonial imagination and scientific ecological management, so that the lay definition of environment has come to inhabit the partial image that it occupies. I've been thinking a lot for so many years about what counts as a life, mainly through a racial register. In my work, I approached that question by asking first linguistically about the biopolitical manipulations allowable through a grammar, and then about hierarchies of being that included animals, humans, and the vegetal, and were available as intimate logical structures by which humans could be projected into life or death under deferrals of their own humanity. And also about surprising travels of animacy, potencies that reversed hierarchies of agency in one fell swoop. So becoming human with others, to draw from the title of this roundtable, isn't and hasn't been my priority. I'm wondering rather about becoming inhuman with others, finding a commons there in the uneven yet sticky blurrings of an ashy space in the temporal reorderings. That was my cat, Mikey. He could have canceled this session, but I'm glad I'm still here. In the temporal reorderings of life after death, death after life. And here sits it, the real inhuman, the dead, the inorganic or the organic inanimate, and it, the pronoun that I and other beings risk being called under many different terms of intersectional difference and so-called dehumanization. It, however, for me, is also a luxury, and it shouldn't be. The violence of pronominal it, rather than the binary gender granting he or she, is a grammatical matter, and it is proper to English, while its inhumanizing violence is in fact relatively rare around the world, where linguistic dehumanization must occur by other means. That is to say that it, not they, is the grammatical correlate for the mundane linguistic reference of third-person pronouns for most languages. That includes Mandarin Chinese, Cantonese Chinese in a different way, and where I'm living, Rumsen Ohlone language as well. I love its own subterfuge, which sits alongside its mundanity. The it I invite others to use as a pronoun for me is ultimately a plea for taxonomic indistinction, for intoxicated blurring, for crip and trans refusal, for a definitively racialized inhuman embrace of our non-human companions. Julieta Singh's Heading On Against Mastery sits here with me. In the precision of distinction, and Bourdieu's work on class isn't irrelevant here, there's something about the grasp of identificatory skill, suggesting a colonial template of taxonomic adherence and cognitive virtuosity that I really do not want. In spite of and along with my scholarly forms of insistence on the colonial present as a difference-making machine and the memory of that difference, I want somehow also to recover a loss of distinction, to take on and love the possibilities of indifference. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your comments. Next, Erika, are you ready?
Hi, I am. I'm just showing my screen. We're going to have the alienation of PowerPoint in addition to the alienation of Zoom. So sorry about that, but I'm hoping it's going to keep me slightly on time.
Yep, and it's showing quite nicely. Yep, it's
okay.
Yep, great. Do you proceed?
Excellent. A long time ago, in about 2009 or 2010, when I and the man I call my academic husband, my co-writer in many things, Steve Hobden, were thinking about writing what became post-human international relations. Steve said, when we were talking about the examples we might use, let's talk about pandemics. And I said, oh, I think that would be quite boring. Well, how wrong was I? And how right, of course, was Steve. But here am I, without Steve, talking about the leaky boundaries of species in relation to COVID. And it's great to be here, even though we are on Zoom, and even though I am behind PowerPoints. And I think this is a really exciting conference and a really exciting panel. So I'm really chuffed to be asked. Thanks very much. So I'm going to start off by thinking about zoonotic pandemics and species relations. Think about how dominant discourses of separatism are racialized. And I've been thinking quite a lot since lockdown about the kind of political responses to the pandemic in terms of bordering practices and rebordering. And then I'm going to finish by thinking about different kinds of zoonotic politics that we might adopt. So it's absolutely nothing new and nothing original to claim that the trade in live animals and industrial animal agriculture leads to the development of zoonoses. So the World Health Organization said it in 2010, but they weren't the first either. And we've had warnings from various sources in relation to COVID. that the pandemic itself constitutes an alarm that nature can take no more. So for Jane Goodall, interviewed recently, our disrespect for wild animals and our disrespect for farmed animals has created this situation. And certainly if we think back about the history of zoonoses, then many of our engagements with different species have led to problematic diseases. If we think of the so-called Spanish flu, about which a lot has been said recently, originating in aquatic birds, or MERS, which certainly in the UK we didn't hear too much about, but was catastrophic for those humans who were subject to the contagion. And of course we know about SARS and bats and avian flu. And for Tom van Doren, these pandemics are really driven through our relationships with animals. So I'm sure we're very much aware, certainly many panels at this conference are, that we're in the midst of the 6th mass extinction. And when we think about the figures and the proportions of land mammals that are farmed and the proportions of land mammals that are humans, those figures are really quite arresting. And certainly there are many authoritative sources that suggest that over the next 2 decades, the mass extinction is proceeding apace, with around 1 million species predicted to be no more. In terms of Western news media, certainly in the early weeks of lockdown, in countries like the UK, there was, in certain parts of the popular press, a kind of demonising discourse around wet markets, particular practices in certain countries. But certainly there is a kind of problem, an endemic condition of animal agriculture that leads to the likelihood of zoonotic pandemic. And what there wasn't much in the news about was the ways in which violent practices in the animal industrial complex can intensify in situations of emergency. So certainly farms, slaughterhouses, these are very much places of exception. And between April and September of this year, there were alternative depopulation methods used to kill animals, such as smothering them in foam, as would be used in firefighting, or suffocating them by closing air vents, poisoning them, or, well, blunt force trauma, what a lovely terminology that is, throwing a small animal to the ground until it's dead. There was practices of culling in other animal industries, such as zoos or science laboratories. And I suppose this reveals not only, COVID reveals our human fragility, but also the very extreme vulnerability of certain animals caught in species relations. But whilst the next zoonotic pandemic waits in the wings, as there are many warnings about, we're encouraged to return to something that looks like normal, the normal of mass human poverty or global inequality, species extinction, climate change. But lockdown did reveal some interesting elements, certainly in a country like the UK. So we had closures of businesses, public spaces, but we also had the burgeoning of the digital economy with all its pros and cons, travel restrictions, but the rewilding, the reclaiming of space, as well as the abandonment of relationships with animals. In Britain, for example, animal rescue centres were inundated, and Mel won't like to hear this, but particularly people would be surrendering cats because the door is a leaky border when it comes to a cat flap, and there were fears around the contamination that cats could bring in to the home. So just a few images that struck me: the wild goats of Wales entering into the city, and they must have had a marvellous time and created a humongous smell. All kinds of debates about ways in which we should interact with feral species, such as street dogs in India. In some cities, at first there were bans on feeding animals on the street, and then there was a realization that if street dog populations weren't maintained, that actually plagues of rats could be a consequence. And we had a lot of help from our Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK, encouraging the back to normal behaviour that has really helped us in terms of the second wave of the pandemic. Now, I know there are many people listening to this who will be experts in bordering, and I don't want to kind of introduce bordering 101, but these are the kinds of ideas from bordering theory that have struck me as particularly important in thinking about responses to the pandemic. So the idea of the border as both physical and political, separating the safe from the unsafe, us from them, and the ways in which bordering is a racialized practice. So it's both geographic and territorial, also epistemic. And Elias has been a lot in my mind. So his kind of definition of the processes of civilization as being about uplift, as he puts it, from the animalic. And certainly those people, flora, fauna that are seen as particularly problematic, as uncivilized. So bordering implies inclusions, exclusions, too much coffee and too much talking into a screen, sorry. But we also have bordering in everyday lives and practices, as pointed out recently by Cassidy Yuval-Davis and Weems, for example. So in terms of a response to COVID-19, human beings have been bordered in different ways, and increasingly so, with restrictions on movement and travel, closure of public spaces, and we've become increasingly privatized in many ways. We're also subject to different forms of biosecurity, whether it's the pretty ineffective track and trace system we have in countries like the UK, or encouragement to wash our hands. And you might think, if we go along with Haraway, that COVID might indicate the closeness of our relationship with other creatures, the porosity of what it means to be an animal. But a lot of the response has been to emphasize separation. It's not that their pathogens make us up, it's that their pathogens are other and must be mastered. And Nicole Shukin says that certainly there is a kind of pathologization of species mixing, and that this is very much linked to practices of racial othering. So we've had media discourses around wet markets, the bushmeat trade, even small scale mixed farming as dangerous, as backward practices that should be eliminated. But of course, the borders are always leaky, and all such practices are always integrated in global supply chains. There's no innocent and no pure. And of course, wild animals are increasingly bordered by habitat destruction continually, all the time. And the fragmentation of those populations is not just causing pressure on other creatures, but also causing pressure on humans. And this increases our propensity to zoonoses. Sorry, it's week 3 of teaching and my voice is taking a battering. But for Hinchcliffe, actually international efforts to control the problem are really very much part of it. So the WHO has a biosecurity model which is kind of based on separation, or I would say based on bordering and discouraging forms of interspecies intimacy. So a virtuous and predominantly, it is presumed, white North is engaged in separation, purification, and control. In some cases, the response to other species is to border through killing. It's an ultimate form of bordering, if you like. So with species who have had epidemic blame for particular zoonoses, there have been attempts to extinguish host species. So with the avian flu outbreak in Hong Kong, all the chickens that were farmed were actually killed. They were depopulated and then repopulated. And these are responses which in my work with Steve Hobden, we've come to call imperial human responses. So Foucault will be having a field day, I think. There's much to say about the technology of life in COVID, with our population-based decision-making absolutely writ large and very obvious, and forms of bodied governmentality, this whole kind of discourse of washing your hands, covering your face, making space. But we need to extend notions of biopower to the zoopolitical, I think. So back to Shukin again with her animal capital, which I liked very much. And she talks there back in 2009 about zoonotic origin stories being racialized because they're involving very racially specific notions of the entanglement of body and the entanglement of matter. But of course, bordering practices are always in tension. So while we are entangled porous plastic, those borders are also continually breached and policed through exclusions and expulsions. So why I think COVID requires a critical post-humanist analysis and less half-baked than what I've been suggesting here is because of this leakiness around boundaries, because of the need to problematize the centrism of the human in our account, and to suggest that current social relations, of which I see species relations as one, are problematic. So what can COVID teach us in how we might live differently? Or certainly, I and Steve in our last book took up Freya Hagen's reading of Adorno and the call to live less wrongly in our attempts to change the world. So thinking about what relations we might want to break and what we might want to nurture and make. So certainly in terms of what I would like to make or break, I'd like to see the development of more contextual eating practices with respect to both plant and animal life. I think the tide of industrial animal farming is a colonial imposition that is ever advancing, but needs serious resistance. And I think we also need to attend to situated knowledges about how to live with other species in ways which aren't imperial and which aren't exploitative. And I'm worried about the time, so I'm just going to carry on to the end. So the boundaries of species are leaky. I expect I'm preaching to the converted for many at this conference, but a lot of the kind of political decisions that are made are embedded in a territorializing and bordering model. But this is kind of sticking plaster politics, really. So what I would like to see is the development of a post-humanist zoonotic politics that wants to reorder species relations and other hierarchies of domination rather than seeking to border and to reborder the leaky boundaries of species. And also that would be a politics that understands the world as creaturely, that our lifeways are situated, bodied and co-constituted in just the way that Francis was so nicely talking about at the beginning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erika, and thank you everybody for your fantastic presentations, fantastic propositions on multiple different issues, from entanglements to questions around lives, animal, human, composites, to thinking about also responses to how to think about separation, flows, and the different kinds of politics of it. What we will do now is we will open up to the questions. So if you look to the Q&A box in your Zoom thing here, you'll see the Q&A box, so you can ask a question through there, and then we will proceed from there. So we have a first question that I can see here, but it's rather a lengthy one. Just give me a moment as I read through it. It's a statement. Can I ask you, by the way, just two things? One, those people on the other side, in the audience side, do note that we can't actually see you, but just because we can't see you, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't kind of relax into a conversation insofar as is possible. As Mel was noting, this is a strange way of corresponding with each other on some level, because we have a kind of a system whereby we're in a separate group here, us on the speaker side, and then there's another group out there, and the only thing that sits between us is this Q&A box. So I hope you can really use the Q&A box as a space for conversation, if you like, a space for commentary, in a way that also makes us, perhaps on this side, feel like we're part of a conversation with you. So if you can do that, that would be a good thing, just from our end. And of course, from our end, if we engage with the questions in that same vein, that would be all the better in this slightly complex situation. So the question is, I believe, directed at Zakiyyah, and it's in relation to enlightenment. I think we should separate the political thought of the Enlightenment with the sciences developed during that period. The political thought of the Enlightenment posed the elimination of slavery and other terrible things that happened during the 18th century. In my opinion, this is one of our contributors, of our audience members. In my opinion, the development of biology and the construct of the nation has something, on the 21st century, has something deeply problematic with the development of racism. Okay, it's a comment. It's a comment more than a question. Zakiyyah, have you had a chance to peruse it, and do you have a reflection or response of any kind to pose?
Yeah, so I'll just, sorry, flying pencil. Never mind. I will just pick up on some pieces of the question or the comment. And so maybe if I just break it down into keywords, I can say some things about those keywords. So one of the things that I say in the book, I'll just take the question of polygenesis first. Because the other things I don't know yet what I'm gonna say. But you know, one of the things I say in the book is, you know, I think that there's been a lot of emphasis on the notion of polygenesis versus monogenesis. And, you know, typically monogenesis is seen as like the hero in that history. But, you know, for me, the book is really about the violence of humanization. The book isn't really about people who claim that the African is not human. Of course, those people exist, but that's not what my book is about. My book is about the terror of humanization and how humanization, the recognition of humanity in Blackened people, becomes a conduit for bestialization, for animalization, for the thingification of Black people, rather than some kind of exit or solution. And so what I found is that whether racial hierarchy is positioned in a unified theory of universal humanity or a theory of, you know, divergent origins of the species, those distinctions really were not very clear cut. They weren't very clear cut. They were tautological in their formulations. The whole debate was. And both ended up producing Blackened people as a border concept, and both of them fixated on the scene and means of Black female biological reproduction as the place to hash out a debate about the boundaries of ontology. And so for me, those kinds of distinctions actually don't get us in a different place. They're different pathways, but different pathways to ultimately getting to this same point of this obsession with Black female anatomy, reproduction, and as the fulcrum for determining ontological borders and typology and taxonomies of all types. So I would say that about that part of it. I would say something probably pretty similar about Enlightenment, philosophy. And, you know, one of the things I insist on in the book is that, you know, the Enlightenment is not a single univocal tradition or set of ideas, but is a space of all kinds of contestation and disagreements. But, you know, my focus in the book was to show how, you know, the ways that we've read Enlightenment thought, including its kind of most well-known architects, that we haven't I offer a different way of reading people like Hegel, where we think of Hegel as, you know, the principal figure for the discourse of the dehumanization of the African, but that's actually not what Hegel says at all. Hegel describes the African as an animal man eternally. And so that this distinction between human and animal is caught up in, entangled with, and inseparable from his discourse on the African, right? So when he's thinking about the globality and global history, he is narrating a distinction between human and animal, but the fulcrum of that, in terms of administering that distinction, rests on the administration of race. So I think that Enlightenment is complex, I agree. But even for people who are advocating for the abolishment or any of slavery, oftentimes those figures were not in opposition to racial hierarchy or even ontological cuts in the species where Black people are a separate kind of being. So I think that, you know, these notions of being against slavery and of monogenesis, that these become shorthand for a romance we want to tell about the past. But I think when we actually look a little bit closer, we can see that there are many routes to get to the same place. Thank you for the question.
Thank you for that fantastic response. I've just been noting here that the other side can't actually see the questions that they are posing for us. So there's a kind of a double, triple layer here. Only we know the questions that you are asking from us when we are having a dialogue with you. So that's creates a different level of kind of complication. That said, what I'd like to do is to go to a question next, and this is a question for Francis. I have a question for Francis. You mentioned that you have resisted the urge of education to make an individual of you. I found this very thought-provoking. What practices would you employ to resist this individuality, and what role would this resistance play in decolonial practices and futures? Francis, would you like to take that question next?
Yeah, it's partly as a result of upbringing, socialization. If you have it constantly drummed into you that you are not your own person, and that you are the result of relationships of various kinds, and you need to foster those relationships in order to keep the logic going. Then even when you subscribe to the calling to become an individual, as one would notice through the sort of education that we have and through the market economy, there's a clear tension between personal success and collective success and inclusive success. And you may run as you like. We have the habit of hiding our phone numbers, and every time you change your address, you hope nobody would follow up and know where you live. But they have our relations have diviner instincts to be able to source you out and make you part and parcel of a world that you are cultivated to be. So there's a certain, I'm sure you're familiar with when you speak to various Africans, whether on the continent or in the diaspora, this emphasis on inclusive success and is represented differently in different locations. Here in Southern Africa, is about Ubuntu. A person is a person because of others. And sometimes it is caricatured by those hurrying to migrate into the middle classes and subscribing precisely to this idea of the autonomous individual, and it's called black tax. And many people who are your relations frown a lot on that, because it can't be translated into black tax. It is translated through the need to contextualize your personal success, to bring a certain bit of family history or communal history to bear on the makings of you, so that you can see the linkages that have all added up to making you who you are, from immediate family to community to teachers, even to politicians who may be distant from you, but clearly making decisions that have a bearing on who you become. Basically, it is succeeding in conversation with the various factors that make your life not easy to sum up or to summarize into neat dichotomies, I think. And I think if we approach the world with that humility of incompleteness and the sense that our humanity is not complete if we do not factor in where others are in relation to us, then this could be a very good framework for decoloniality. Decoloniality for me is about accounting for the silences and in the making of our histories, factoring debt and indebtedness into the equation of who we are. And even if we do not pay back the debts, if we acknowledge them enough, then people would understand that we are human. we have a sense of history. We don't go into this vacuous claims of being self-made. Even if self-made actually means just being callous and oblivious of the fact that you are propped up by the sweat of others and by the relationships that have made you in one way or another. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We have a question next for Erika. And of course, each panelist, do also think, if you want to also jump in, perhaps put your hand up if you want to come in to answer some of the questions that are directed at individual people. Of course, they are also for everybody. The questions are, in a sense, for everybody. So for Erika, in this instance, do you feel there are particular methods through which we might understand the world in a creaturely manner? While it is sometimes relegated from more than human theory, do you imagine that phenomenology may be a help? Similar to what you mentioned earlier, Astrida Neymanis argues that embodiment is leaky and therefore always more than human. I wonder what we might learn about this leaking in and out through embodied phenomenological approach. Oh dear, it's been a long day.
I'll probably be doing the same thing now. Thanks very much, Christopher, for your question. I'll start just with the statement in the middle. Yes, definitely. I think embodiment is absolutely always leaky. I think we're made up in relation with other beings and things, and we, you know, every single so-called human being is a multi-species crowd, and collectivities of humans are multi-species crowds also. So definitely, there's lots of leaking and relationality going on. But I also think the very category human is deeply problematic, which is why I'm kind of drawn to this idea of thinking more creaturely. So yes, I do think experiential knowledge is important, but I'm kind of a little personally wary of some of the ways white Western scholarship has kind of run with that. So sometimes it does seem to mean that our experiential knowledge is about going for a walk in the woods, which implies a certain kind of privilege, and being kind of enlightened really on an individual level. So that does concern me. I mean, I suppose that's how I read the work of somebody like Jane Bennett. It's kind of you're enlightened in your interactions with certain beings and things, but this seems to be such a kind of individualized process that almost kind of detaches us and is almost disembodied, really. But certainly in some of the empirical work that I've done, I'm always using forms of qualitative methodology, often that takes me outside with humans and other creatures. And talking and understanding is my favorite. It was my favorite kind of mode of operation, really. But I also think we need that critical edge, critical imagination and contestation. I also worry that some ethnographic accounts, for example, in animal studies, even some of them that purport to be quite critical, end up with quite a lot of thick description. And I don't think that quite gets us to where I want to be with a kind of critical lens on the world. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would anybody else like to come in at this stage from the speakers? If not, I will take some further questions. I will take two questions in one, in fact, and I think we can do a... Oh.
Can I just say something about this? If I understood the question, it was about like a creaturely perspective. I mean, one of the things that immediately comes to mind is, I guess for me, I've always been resistant to certain kinds of attempts to know creaturely perspectives or to gain access to them, because I've always worried that that there is in that process maybe not enough attentiveness to opacity and difference. And I'm much more drawn to the idea of what it means to experience rather than attempt to know, because I do worry about a tendency of an attempt to master the perspective or to override difference and position oneself in a position of knowledge. And I'm wondering what might come out of surrendering to the idea that that project is something that we actually can't do, and that there might be other kinds of ethical possibilities that come into play when we're not first and foremost trying to understand or understand from the perspective of the other, but actually just experience the other. So I don't know, those are some things that come to mind from my perspective.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I think that actually links up with the questions that are coming. There are two questions in the box at the moment. One is from Tony from Aberystwyth, who I know actually because I'm his PhD supervisor, and he's working on a project on post-human politics and so on. And he asks, I wanted to ask, and it's particularly directed to Erika, but not, I don't think uniquely as such. I wanted to ask you, how far do you think zoonotics could take post-anthropocentric biopolitics? That is, how do we bind the notions of power with notions of imbrications, leakages, some poeticism, as inspired by Haraway, to theorize dominant forms of responses to pandemics? And so on. So that's Tony's question. And then there's also an intriguing and important question from Moe Suzuki. It says, thank you so much for the amazing presentations. I would love to hear what other speakers think about or have other speakers or hear other speakers respond to Mel's point about their main concern being not becoming human with others, the title of the panel, but rather becoming inhuman with others. So it's a question from Mel or by our audience, from Mel in a sense to the whole panel. What do you think about Mel's suggestion on that front? So if we take these two questions, and there aren't any further there, and we have 4 minutes to go, I'm afraid, I thought what we might do is do a round. And so if you have any final thoughts in relation to any of the questions, I thought the questions also about the question to Francis was an interesting one, perhaps also for Mel and Zakiyyah. So I just mentioned that. But if you can take whichever question you like, and we then go. Now I would start with Francis, but he's no longer here. He's missing somehow from this group. So with that in mind, perhaps could we come to Mel actually first? If you could respond to the various questions, which I think have interesting linkages with your presentation.
Yeah, I just want to say I so enjoyed this panel. Thank you so much for curating this set of thinking, bringing us together. And I think one thing I want to say, I'm hearing these threads that resonate with each other in our responses. And unfortunately, we can't hear what the audience is thinking as well. But I'm ever mindful of the continuous, almost cynical experiment of the use of language itself, and the assumption, right, that we are working with somehow kind of categorical certainties that we can somehow operationalize them for the further production of knowledge as we do together. But I think, in thinking about Zakiyyah's work and others, I'm reminded to just consistently bracket the kinds of linguistic traffic we're working in. That seems this first level, which is often forgotten. And so for me, what's beautiful about this panel is the practice of maybe Zakiyyah experiencing incommensurabilities, right? And I think we're using terms that overlap, like human. And of course, I think there are important historicizations we need to make about them. But I'm very comfortable with also acknowledging the incommensurabilities that sit with a term like this. And that somehow feels more enabling for the kind of the pursuits that I want to do collaboratively with others. And like I said, it's really the only kind of work I want to do going forward.
Oh, sorry. Thank you very much. Francis, would you like to make comments? You are back with us. Any comments on kind of final comments for the panel in relation to the questions? I'm not sure if you had a chance to hear some of the latest questions, but any final reflections perhaps to the panel as a whole, or any other thoughts you had on others' presentations or answers?
I'm sorry, my connection started acting up, refusing me any pretensions to being human exclusively. So I didn't follow the questions, but it's been an exciting panel, and I think these are issues to pursue. And I'm available for any conversations after this. Thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic. Zakiyyah, do you have any final reflections for the panel?
Yeah, just like first, I'm just really grateful. There's a lot that I'm going to continue to think about, and just say that there were some things, I'm going to speak to Mel's comment. There were some things in Mel's presentation that really resonated with me. I am also interested in, you know, I think you used the word inhuman, but I might say being unhuman. I'm interested in being unhuman. I'm also interested in being ungendered. And so that was like, I really appreciated what you were saying about it. And this is major for me because there's also things that I want to be careful of that are grounded in the history of Blackness, which is I have had a reticence to embrace some particular tendencies within post-humanist and new materialist discourse around ontological slippage and a kind of celebratory or embrace of ontological slippage. And that is hard for me because precisely the history of what I'm calling the plasticization of Black ontology is the history of ontological slippage. And so for me, that history has been so much a racial nightmare. There is actually a history of that as an experiment. And so these are things I don't totally know how to reconcile. Both the desire to be unhuman and to be ungendered, and slippages of sex gender, and slippages of metaphysical ontological categories. And then the last thing is that I was really struck by what Francis shared and felt a lot of affinity to it. But for me, the thing about what was interesting about a flatter ontology and what Francis shared was the being meat for others. So eating, but also being eaten. And I think that what seems to constantly be occluded or avoided is that a more level world means a taking on and a redistribution of violence and a redistribution of precarity, of death, of dying. And so there seems to be a way that people want, and I think this ties to what Erika was saying, people want a different world, but they don't want to be meat. And I think that's a problem.
Thank you for your comments. Erika, any final responses or reflections?
Just a quick reply to Tony. No, I haven't written anything. That's why I said it's half-baked, what I was saying, but this is what I've been thinking about, and let's have a conversation by email or other means about it. I also liked the inhuman with others. I think in many ways, Mel's right, we are talking across each other, and there are lots of kind of linkages with the kinds of terms we're using. So certainly in my idea of the creaturely, it kind of taps into that very tension between how can we be embodied with others, and how can we also recognise the histories of power? I think that's it. I think that's where I'll leave it. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to the panelists for what I hope you all agree on the other side as well. Has been an absolutely fantastic panel. What an interesting set of reflections. And I really do think that these will feed into the conversations in the next couple of days in a really direct way. I hope so. So please do keep on thinking on the thoughts. Lots of very interesting, important reflections, but we are out of time. So we will have to leave it there. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you, of course, to the organizers, and thank you to the audience. It's been great to have you here, and I hope you have an excellent